Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. We don't have a microphone here set up, so I hope you can hear me. My name is Jonathan Sawyers, and I'm a PhD student in New Testament and Early Christian Literature, for those of you who don't know me. And it's my pleasure, my distinct pleasure, to welcome you to today's event in the Divinity School's Craft of Teaching program. We're sponsored today by the Hebrew Bible and the Early Christian Studies workshops and the Bible Studies area. And before I begin, I've been asked to make two announcements. One is that you sign in if you wish to receive credit for this session this afternoon towards your own Craft of Teaching program participation. And to make you aware of another upcoming event on our schedule of events that's going on this Friday afternoon starting at 4:30, at which our own Allison Gray and some others will be participating on a panel discussion entitled Helping Students Cope with Pluralism and Criticism in the Classroom. So please come if you are able to do so and if you're interested. But our topic this afternoon is the art of lecturing. And we've invited two renowned and experienced educators in the academic study of religion to share their reflections on lecturing in different pedagogical settings across the span of their respective careers. So allow me, please, briefly to introduce our two speakers. Professor Hindi Nyman is Associate Professor in the Department of Religious Studies and the Program in Judaic Studies at Yale University, where she has taught since 2011. Prior to that, Professor Nyman taught for over a decade at the Universities of Toronto and Notre Dame. Among her many other publications on topics in ancient Judaism, Professor Nyman is the author of a monograph forthcoming from Cambridge University Press entitled Losing the Temple and Recovering the Future, an analysis of 4th Ezra, a portion of which she graciously shared with us yesterday at a workshop this afternoon in this very room. Professor Nyman, as she tells me, is currently teaching two courses at Yale, one entitled Prophecy in Context, the other a doctoral seminar with Professor Harry Attridge on Philo of Alexandria. Dean Margaret Mitchell is Shaler Matthews Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity here in the Divinity School and has been since 2010 its dean, as you know. Before her appointment here at the university, Dean Mitchell taught at McCormick Theological Seminary, a stone's throw or so away here in the neighborhood of Hyde Park. In addition to her administrative duties, Dean Mitchell is currently translating and preparing for publication a number of John Chrysostom's sermons on Pauline passages, and she's also writing a commentary on 2 Corinthians. I know many of you are, because you have told me, you're looking forward to her Galatians and James class, Traditions and Conflict, which she will teach again in the spring quarter. Before we begin, a very brief word regarding how we will allocate the next 90 or so minutes. First, our two speakers will each spend 15 or 20 minutes sharing their reflections on what the art of the lecture means to them. Then I will attempt to moderate the discussion between them and you, the members of the floor, on that topic for the next 45 minutes or so. And I must say that we will need to conclude our time precisely around 6 o'clock because both Dean Mitchell and Professor Nyman have other appointments to which they must attend. So please, without further ado, join me in welcoming Professor Nyman here to the University of Chicago.
Thank you for the gracious invitation and this wonderful opportunity to think with you about teaching. It's always humbling and challenging to talk about what we do as teachers and how we achieve effective pedagogy. Today, without being too alarmist, I want to talk a little bit about my experience of enjoying. I love lecturing and I love teaching and thinking out loud with students, but to suggest that I think the lecture format for undergraduate is currently in crisis. And this really has to do with the way in which we, as faculty, as teachers, need to think and possibly even rethink how to engage our students and how to transform the classroom in a way that can engage students that are, I think, less used to hearing someone talk for anywhere between 90 minutes, even sometimes longer? How can we keep students engaged and create a vibrant and intellectually stimulating environment? I would like to think, for the most part, I think our teachers did not need to think and rethink their approach to pedagogy in light of technology. There was the occasional use of the overhead projector, but seriously, nothing that was transformative for them and transformative for us as people who were learning how to teach. In my own lectures and more generally my teaching, my goals are threefold. I want to demonstrate the integration of disciplines and bridge the gulf between antiquity and modernity, showing the relevance, embracing and owning up to anachronism at times, but also to teach it, that is to teach an anachronism as something that's inevitable, so that we can invite connections that bridge that gulf. To help undergraduates understand theological presuppositions in our own thinking and our teaching, canonical divides, aesthetic judgments about genre and form, about what we prefer, about what's compelling. Two, I want the students deeply engaged in the implications for the work that we're doing. Sometimes it means reaching out to the students where they are, figuring out how to use contemporary culture and to get them to where I am so that we can read. And this leads me to my third point. Most importantly, is to teach them how to read deeply and carefully, to help them find their way into the text. Whatever text I'm teaching, even in a history of scholarship course, or kind of a broad strokes course in religion, in ancient Judaism, across scriptural materials, I'm always grounded by the primary text. There's a lot of writing that I do in class and out of class with them so that they can be engaged. And then there are other creative ways that I started to share with a group of you last night about how else we can engage students even in the lecture. In my own commitment, I've tried, imperfectly, to embrace technology, to create a stimulating, sitting at the edge of your seat environment through teaching and through the communication of ideas. I'm going to share my most radical example with you in a few moments, not yet. But having students bring contemporary examples, sometimes from music and pop culture, in this example I'm going to share with you, to illustrate the points that I'm trying to make, to bring them home and to read deeply. I'm very, very interested even in using the lecture format to help students learn how to speak, how to develop their own rhetoric, the art of persuasion and participation, what Rosenzweig calls Sprachdenken, right? Thinking, speaking. There are dangers and risks in engaging pop culture or in technology. There's the loss of detail. I already indicated, and we can speak about this a little bit more later, about the worries of anachronism. And then the very art of lecture that I said I felt was in crisis from my own experience at Yale and Toronto and at Notre Dame. We don't want to give up the opportunity to teach them how to think through speech. I think this is a very, very important art, and it's an art that we've been trained in. So I want to tell you a quick story, and then I want to show you the craziest course I ever taught. And I'm sharing it with you, with my students. We prepared the presentation together. And it was the most successful course I've ever taught. And it was the most outrageous course I ever taught. So this is why I want to share it with you. When I was first invited to do this, I had no intention of sharing this course with you, but I am. So first let me just tell you, I developed a course called Scripture in Transition, which I developed in Toronto to be used for any scriptural tradition. It's now been retaught by Islamicists, by students who work in New Testament and early Christianity. I developed it as a course in Hebrew Bible and ancient Judaism, but moving across canonical divides, and then I gifted it to some of my students, and then I moved to Yale. But the first time I taught this class, lecture number 1, I was so proud of this lecture. I just thought, I had all the moves, I had worked on it, there was the handout, the engagement, and at the end of the class, Eric was sitting in the front row, and he turned to me and he said, "Professor Nyman, is that all you're going to do?" And I kind of said, "I'm sorry." And he said, "Well, is that all you're going to do? You're just going to talk and we're going to listen throughout the semester." And I said, "Well, I got the overcoat on him. I said, it's what my father did. It's what my father's father did. And I kind of, I even pulled like the Harvard card. That's what we did at Harvard. What do you mean? And he said, okay, I was just wondering. And I went home and I told this story to my family. And my daughter, who was then 10, said, well, Mama, they're just bored. You need to engage them. It needs to come alive. And I thought, well, I was going to bite the bullet that semester. I could do it. And I added another 12, sometimes 15 hours a week, not just to learn how to do PowerPoint, because it wasn't about translating PowerPoint. It was how to translate the material visually in a compelling way. And I decided to be an anthropologist while I was a lecturer. The material I had, it was all prepared. And I decided to behave like it was a new course. I mean, in some sense it was a new course, but it wasn't a new course in terms of preparation. So each week, each of them, it was two lectures a week, I engaged them by bringing it to life, and I watched them. So I watched them watch me. I watched them move away from the screen, and I had 3 TAs in the back, and I said, I don't want you to tell the students what to do and what not to. I want you to tell me what happens on which classes. When are they on movies? When are they doing games? When are they on Facebook? Tell me what's going on in the class. And it's important. And I also want to say that even when we have zones that are internet free, even when we ask students not to text, it's happening anyway. So the question is, what do you do with that? And I'm going to say something at the very end if time permits. So this was the story about my friend Eric, who, by the way, was checked out in the back of the classroom for most of the semester. I mean, that is, he was doing things other than engaging me. But the students sat up and they woke up. And I continued to run through the class and used a pointer and engaged them with my PowerPoints. And I tried to figure out how to teach differently. I mean, it reminded me in some sense, I'll stick to the narrative. There are a few other times, teaching-wise, where I had to retool myself as a teacher. You see, I use my hands, I use the board. I once had a blind student in a lecture course, and I stopped using the board for the entire semester. And you can see what that would be for me, not to be able to use my hand and use a board. Or PowerPoint. So, there are different kinds of challenges we have as teachers at different times, and this was, for me, a very important moment. I'm going to talk through this class while I go through something like 81 slides very, very quickly. What I want to say about this class, those of you that know a little bit about my work know that my first book was about pseudographic attribution, making false attribution meaningful. And I used the Foucaultian notion of discourse and authorship to talk about the developing, to take seriously the problem of something to be called Shakespearean or Marxist or Mosaic. What does it mean that Moses is said to write the book of Jubilees or the book of Deuteronomy? So trying to make sense of that in a religious context and in a culture where you're praised for saying that, I didn't write this, but Dean Mitchell wrote it. And that's not considered plagiarism, but it's a way of honoring one's teacher and extending a discourse tied to a founder. So I was thinking about that, and I also wanted, because I had this opportunity to teach a freshman seminar. I realize it's not exactly a lecture course, but I'm busy. I've been asked by the dean at Yale to translate it into a lecture course, to thematize and to use the problem of plagiarism, which is a very, very serious problem in all of our colleges, in Chicago, at Yale. We know about it at Harvard and Stanford. So to talk about plagiarism, to talk about authorship, and to talk about originality. Hence, originality. Let's see if we can do this. Oh, sorry. Oops. There we go. Hold on. There we go. So they call themselves. The students now call themselves AOFers, which is, again, they use that kind of a text way of naming the class. These are the questions that I raised. We read Foucault, we read Nietzsche, we read Kierkegaard about authorship and attribution over the course of the semester. I asked them about originality, about constituting forgery, about bridging modernity and antiquity, and about transferring shared concepts. So part of what I wanted to do was help them to understand what these problems were. But what I realized I would fail, it's not that they would not take the class, they might not take the class, but they weren't engaged in the question of who wrote songs, or they didn't care. There was no dog in that fight with respect to Mosaic authorship. So it's not a group of graduate students that have already decided to work on this. What they care about are concepts in modernity. And I said to them, let's think together. This is one example of the question of a school, right? Thinking about Rembrandt's school, thinking about the question of forgery. And this is, of course, was very contemporary last semester when there was a discussion about a Chinese forger who became extremely wealthy. And I'm going to look at a few clips together. This was an example of the reconstruction of Night Watch in a mall. And part of what I wanted to show, how many of you seen this already? Oops, sorry.
Shoppers in the Dutch city of Breda get more than they bargained for.
It's not doing what I want it to. We'll come back to it. What they do in this slide is hold on one second. Let me see if I can get it to move faster. I can't get it to move faster. That's okay. What they do is they reconstruct. Night Watch. This is also a problem with technology. Hold on one second. There you go. So what they do is they reconstruct the Night Watch in the context of a mall, and then we talk about originality and the possibility of this painting, and what does it mean to copy a piece of it or to collectively produce it. And we looked at different kinds of copying and different kinds of forgery. We looked at Monet's Water Lilies and what Cy Twombly did with the same concept in the Brandhorst Museum in Munich, and physically repeating the installation. And then we compared it a bit. We looked at other kinds of repetition. We talked about Banksy and Mr. Brainwash, and we also talked about Believe in People, which is a local graphic artist in New Haven. Because it's so unsafe in New Haven, some of you have been there, we couldn't actually visit the local art. But I was told I couldn't take them into the hood. But this is some of the work that was done. We looked at memes. We talked about the questions of authenticity using contemporary examples. This is a very important Kill Bill. Those of you will watch it for a minute. And the point of this was to show kind of repetition or borrowing. Is anything original or is everything a remix?
There must be some way out of here. Say the joker to the thief.
So here, in this example and in the next example, we talked about covers or redoing musical pieces, which are relatively classic, which date me. And then what they did was they brought examples into the classroom that were much smarter and politically much edgier. And I said to them, hopefully, your examples will be better than my examples. And they were. And then here's another older example. And then this is also about crossing over communities and translation. Let's stop for a moment and say something about the Leonard Cohen examples. I was able to return to the Leonard Cohen examples when we talked about writing and rewriting and interpretation of the figure of David as prophet and as scribe and as king and as transgressive figure, and also to ask this kind of notion of overkill with respect to ancient Jewish and early Christian materials with respect to interpretation. Cohen is pulling not just he's pulling the stuff from Samson, he's pulling the stuff from David. What is he doing and how is he doing it? And I use these contemporary examples to teach what's going on in some of the early Midrashic texts, or some already in the Second Temple period, or other biblical texts. How to understand the question of originality, as well as the question of the legal implications. here is Justin Timberlake and Daft Punk to begin to talk about the mixing of texts. And part of what I wanted to do there was to help them understand even the mixing of sources and to help them understand combined texts that are built together, the way it works and the way it doesn't work. And I'm not going to, just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into all of the musical examples, but let me signal to you the kinds of things I did. So this big lawsuit now with Robin Thicke, this was just this has a teenage daughter written all over it. Does anyone know where this is from? Someone knows. Pitch perfect, right? Yeah. So, is anything original? We looked at the forgery sequence in Zeppelin, and they were angry. They're angry about the Stones. They were angry about Zeppelin. And the angrier they got, the more I was able to thematize the question of plagiarism and the question of originality. But the deeper we went, the more trivial the contemporary examples seemed to them, and the deeper they were prepared to go with me, both with philosophical texts like Nietzsche's inaugural address about the Homeric question, as well as texts like the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice. And I had resources to take them to an exhibit on the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we talked about nomenclature in the scrolls and what scholars did with respect to naming and identification and genre imposition and the question of historicism. And they ran with me faster than I ever imagined, and they wrote 7 papers, and each one of them had the opportunity to revise those papers until they got to A. Some of them did it twice, sometimes they did it 3 times, and each of them were close readings of ancient texts, occasionally engaged with some of the philosophical texts. So lest you think that this was, what they call at Harvard a gut, or I think in England a bird. I don't know what they call them here. I don't think there are any in Chicago, actually, is what I hear. But it wasn't that. That is, it was a very, very serious text. Let me kind of roll with me a little bit. We thought about source criticism and problematized it, but also explained why it was compelling. We took very seriously language of heavenly ascent, but we also understood how it was the work of the imaginal and the work of the creative work. And we didn't only achieve what we achieved in our classroom, but we also achieved this out of the classroom. That is, students not only asked for more work, but I got papers from them, from their other professors. They were writing on Shakespeare, and they problematized authorship. Someone else was working on Tolstoy and tried to understand the role of the figure. So what I did was what I wanted to do was make what I do in antiquity, which is a little bit remote and not kind of compelling to the contemporary world, relevant to them, and to draw in the question of plagiarism. So at the beginning of the semester, they all admitted behind closed doors that it's really not such a big deal. Collaborative work. I just met with Jonathan Lear earlier today, and he talked about how his daughter, who writes for New Girl, how do they write episodes? I don't know if any of you have seen this sitcom. They get together as a group, right? And then one of them goes up and writes it up, and then they get their name on it. So just for that 1 week, it's Tindy Nyman's episode, but it's a collective project. And part of what I wanted to help them understand is what was wrong with what happened at Harvard. What is collaborative work? What's the Bourbaki project of this group of mathematicians that Foucault talks about? How am I doing with time? Do I have another 5 minutes? 5 minutes, perfect. Okay, good. So you see, these are some, and I started comparing, those of you that were with me yesterday, we talked about reboot, or the narratives, contemporary narratives that write and rewrite the past and the present. Enoch, David, hypothesized wisdom, and I put this in quotation. We tried to understand what wisdom is doing. We also tried to understand repeated and politicized use of signs. And here I'm putting a sign for you. Yeah. Here's a text, which I love. But by the time they got to this text, when David was said to write some 4,000 psalms, they read it and they laughed because they understood that it was both serious and somehow absurd or exaggerated. And we talked about the figure, and we returned to Leonard Cohen. This is from Cave 11 from Qumran, 11Q Psalms A. Sorry, I'm not giving you enough context. And we talked about the designation and the naming of these texts, but we also talked about what happened to the figure of David, what happened to the figure of Moses, and the role of figure and the role of text formation. We did it. We did a little unit on Paul. We did a little unit on cue. We moved back and forth, and what I wanted to do is I wanted to leave them with the sense that early Christian and ancient Jewish literature had a lot to teach us about contemporary culture. And that bridge between antiquity and modernity was something that they could walk across, and they could think with the texts of antiquity, and then they could move forward again and use them. Use them as sources, use them as resources, and use them as guides. There's some Enoch material. We talked about, could this really be a biblical hook to generate books and books on the figure of Enoch? To help them understand sometimes this interpretive ethic doesn't work. And there's something much beyond it. I don't just mean oral and written tradition. I mean something very different in the ancient imagination. And here's some fun, right? In a way, Enoch is just a spin-off, just like these shows, an expansion within the same universe. Here we see this is the question about forgery, and this was very much in the news. By the time I got to the MF Doom example, I don't know if you know the MF Doom example where he just wears a mask. They actually found it trivial because his own account, which I just don't have time to talk about the interview now, but in his own
the whole mask thing, really, like, it's a time in hip hop where.
But what they found, and I don't have time now to talk in an extensive way about what he says, but they found it trivial. They didn't find it deep. They were very critical. They were critical of Kierkegaard. They were critical of MF Doom. And then they collectively created what I call the Bourbaki Project. That is using this notion of group of mathematicians. We could have used it. We could have talked about Schlegel and that whole group. People who collectively get together and write as a group, and then to represent their voices as one. They had to afterwards identify who did what, but they also had to own it collectively and get behind it, so that when they understand what collective work is, and they understand what does it mean that a text, when we say about antiquity, well, the author or the authors of 4th Ezra, whoever assembled, this particular text, or multiple voices within a single text. These again are other examples of effacing the self. These are going to be a little bit unfair. You're going to get the reference or not. And then I come back again to what I did with Lady Gaga. And here, the different identities of these figures, of various figures. Beyonce, that's Lady Gaga in Vogue, and how people transform themselves even in contemporary culture, put on another mask or another face. And what does it mean to speak through different voices? And does it undermine the text if we don't know who actually wrote it? Can it still be an effective text if it's a pseudo-Pauline letter? I mean, this is a very important question. Those 11 freshmen now know how to answer that question in a very sophisticated way. It's not about dismissiveness. Pseudo is no longer a negative term. 2 minutes. Okay, here's Bourbaki. The Homeric question from Nietzsche, which is to think about the growth and a forward-moving gesture with respect to tracing and tradition. Silverline, maybe I'll just talk about. I ended thinking a little bit about the reboot. There are films that worked and films that didn't work. I never used a film instead of class time. Class time was reserved always and only for reading texts together. Sometimes philosophical texts, more often than not, the end of text, and at the end of the semester, they wanted more, and they actually all wrote an additional paper at the end of the semester to reflect on notions of trauma and recovery in ancient Judaism. Let me, in my minute and a half left, I'm going to, I can reflect at a later point the ends of the class, what worked and what didn't work, and how I want to fix it. This is part of what I said is humbling by talking to you. I always grade myself when I walk out of a lecture, and I always feel that there's something more that I could have done better, sweeter, smarter, sharper. I feel the same every time I press send to my editor or a publisher. But I want to say this to you because we never stop improving as teachers. And this is what I want to share with you. I had that ethic when I started teaching. 2 points that I didn't have when I started. Students want to learn. I think our students at these great institutions, they learn in different ways. They go on Facebook, they play games, they're distracted, but we need to trust them and engage them as adults. I think there are ways of creating contracts. My colleagues do it in different ways. I do it in different ways. But at an earlier point, I think I was much more rigid. about this, and I'm not sure that rigidity is bad. I'm just saying that in my own experience, my trusting of them in the lecture hall or in a seminar, and to know at the beginning, to let them know, if there's an emergency, step out for it, and no questions will be asked, but you belong here when class starts, and you belong here when class ends, and I want all of you, and I don't want anything else going on. The second part is about, this goes back to Sprachdenken, and with this I want to pass the baton to Professor Mitchell and learn from Professor Mitchell, who is a masterful lecturer, as all of you know. It's really about the creation of lectures and the creation of the classroom. I understand teaching more now than ever to be collaborative and to be, even in a lecture, I work with them, and I always give this little spiel at the beginning of one of my classes. We are building an interpretive community this semester, in a small group or in a group of 120 students. This is what I share with them, and I say, I want to learn from you this semester, and I mean it. I mean it, and no class I ever teach is the same class, even if the syllabus looks the same, which typically it doesn't, in my experience. But part of the work of poesis, the work of creativity in the classroom, of mind meeting mind, and allowing ourselves not just to be humbled by the process of teaching, but to be humbled in the presence of the other's mind, and to think with them. I'm always taught new ways to read, new ways to think, and in this context, my trusting of them has only bore fruit. It doesn't mean that there aren't students who mess up and who slip. But my principle is, and I wasn't as trusting at the beginning. I was more nervous. I was more insecure. I wasn't sure, whether or not, the two guys in the back whispering, how to negotiate that. And I've gotten better at it. And part of it is trusting in myself as a teacher and trusting as them that they're here for the right reasons. And as long as we assume that and we let them know that that's what we believe, I think we'll get the best out of them. And when I had a student this past semester, it's very rare at Yale, he's really messed up, and it was clear all over his eyes and all over his face and all over his body. And I handled it. He came in late repeatedly. He isolated himself. I didn't go to his college dean. I didn't go to the master of his house. We met a few times. We had dinner, and I helped pull them together. And again, there's only so much we can do. But part of it is that teaching can also become very personal with undergraduates. So, assuming the best out of them and that they want to give you the best, I think is the best way to create a community of thinkers, and it's the best way, I think, to live, the life of the mind and to really engage them as a. It's what I mean by pedagogy. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Professor Nyman. Professor Mitchell, the floor is yours.
What did you put?
20.
Oh.
I'll give you a warning at 15.
You ever known me to come in early?
I'll not answer that question.
So, this is a bittersweet experience for me. I haven't taught a lecture course in 3.5 years. And I miss it. Lecturing isn't the only way to teach, and most of what I teach tends to be seminar-based, and when I teach a lecture course, it's not only a lecture, I hope it's a dialogue, but there is something to the art of the lecture, and I think I want to focus on the questions that were given. Sorry about my voice. It is what it is. After a week of this cold. I did half of a master's in education a long time ago when I was teaching high school in Connecticut. And out of that, I learned about 4 or 5 aphorisms that tug at my pedagogical consciousness all the time. And one of those was by Thomas Broom, who was teaching at Boston College at the time. And he always said that when you're on an airplane and someone says to you, "What do you do?" and you say, "I'm a teacher," and then what do they say next? They say, "What do you teach?" And he always answered, students. And that sounds maybe so simple and maybe even trite, but it's not at all. And so one of the reasons it's always different is that the students are different. And so a part of any pedagogical model, whether it's lecturing, whether it's discussion group, whether it's what you do in your office, etc., you're teaching individual people who bring a lot of talents and gifts and questions and thoughts and complications to the work. And so for me, one of the real challenges of a lecture class is how to have that personal knowledge of my students while at the same time classes can get pretty big. And that's why I limit the Intro to New Testament at 60, because I can't learn 60 names, more than 60 names in 10 days and hold on to them. And for me, trying to know the names of the students, even at the very beginning, is just really, really important. Also, grading more than 60 Galatians papers and 60 final exams is more than I can do. And in fact, for all that you might feel sorry for me for not having taught the Intro to New Testament for the last 3 years, I also actually have had at least 3 days of spring break over the last 3 years, which I haven't had for the previous 11 years when I spent spring break reading 60 papers. Now I'm going to actually take direction today, and you're going to hear a little bit in various places that my own teaching is very much conditioned both by what I teach, which is New Testament and early Christian literature, and by the way I think about it as a scholar, which is in relation to ancient literary culture. And I do think within the genres of ancient literary culture, and one of those is Zete which are questions and answers. And Jonathan gave me questions and gave us questions, and I'm going to actually try to answer some of them. So, question number 1. What do you understand to be the artistic marks or qualities of an effective lecture? Put differently, what effects do you hope your lectures will have, regardless of their topics, on those to whom you lecture, or maybe with whom you lecture? And what skills or competencies do you seek to hone in yourself when planning and delivering an effective lecture? Very good question. Let me begin with them. The effects that I hope that students will gain from a lecture: comprehension, skills acquisition for their own independent reading, a sense of how one weighs arguments and comes to a conclusion, the sense of discovery, genuine discovery, and the excitement of intellectual inquiry, and the cultivation of their own questions, and a sense of the power that's in those questions, not their deficit. I think that often students tend to think that if I have a question, it's because I didn't get it. And I think that generating in students the sense that a question is in fact one of the smartest things you can do in this classroom, and that a part of what you do next is up to you as to you've generated that question. So those are some of the things that I hope will happen to those in the classroom. There are others. Another of those great sentences from my half-done, and you can tell I'm an incomplete teacher by my half-done master's degree in education. Another of those is that in every class that is taught, there are 3 things, there are 3 curricula that are going on. One is the explicit curriculum, one is the implicit curriculum, and one is the null curriculum. The explicit curriculum is what's on the syllabus, it's what we say that we're doing. The implicit curriculum is what it feels like we're actually doing when we're doing what we say we're doing. And the null curriculum is what we're not doing, and oftentimes what we're not doing is speaking louder than what we're doing, whether explicitly or implicitly. And I think about that a lot. So I try to limit the effects that I hope my lecturing have on somewhere between the explicit and the implicit curriculum. But I do think that there are elements of the null curriculum, or there are things that are happening in the room that are happening because they're not happening in the room. And so making the students and myself responsible for those recognitions is, I think, a key piece. But back to the implicit curriculum, I do hope that they will catch fire for the material that we're studying. But that's not on the syllabus. That to pass this class, you have to have a B+ or better level of interest in the material. Right? It's not on the syllabus, but I do hope that, and I think that good lecturing just might have a chance to bring students in on a field of inquiry, to make them thirsty for there's more there. I just love that sense of, wow, it's more interesting than I thought. It's more complicated than I thought. And not in a way that paralyzes one. Oh, it's more complicated, so you do that. But instead that empowers people to join that inquiry. I hope that's my aspiration. Now, in myself, Indy said, you grade yourself after every lecture. So do I. I've rarely made better than a B+. It's really hard, this work. It's really hard. But here's some of the things I try to do. And most of you, there are too many witnesses here who know how often I fail at doing this. Focus. I try to keep myself to focus. I try to tell myself beforehand, no matter what, no matter all the byways and highways you're going to go on, three things that no matter what else happens in here today, that you have made those 3 points, and that everyone unmistakably will know at least we did those 3 things. And I do that a lot by repetition, sometimes probably annoyingly so, but rounding off air paragraphs, rounding off sections with this is this point. So everybody ought to come out of here with at least these 3 key points. Because I can get caught in my argument, and it can sometimes be hard to follow. I want to be sure that at least these 3 things, or there's nothing canonical about the number 3, but that's what I think with. I rely on ancient rhetoric, and so the virtues of a good lecture, to my mind, are clarity, brevity, accuracy, and vividness. And the 4 of them going together is my aspiration. That I hope always to be accurate, but I hope also to, in my quest for clarity and brevity, not lose my accuracy. And that's tough. That is very tough, because sometimes one has to convey things that are really more complicated, but there's a time for some of the more complex, and there's a time for this is the clear, crisp, and if we want to go further, this is where we would go. And so disciplining among those virtues is for me one of the great challenges of lecturing well. I think about it a lot. Other things, I try hard, or at least I try to think about on-ramps, intellectual, mental on-ramps, how to bring others into the inquiry. One of the things that's really important to me as a social, political, ethical commitment is that I will not teach in such a way that I have the text and you don't. In other words, that what my class is about is I control the text and its interpretation, and you are spectators of my virtuosity. That's bad lecturing. That's bad pedagogy. So whatever the tools are, and I've ruined a fair number of forests in my time generating handouts because I want you to have something in front of you so you too can be in the dialogue about what we're talking about. So whether it's Galatians or whether it's an inscription from Jerusalem about what a synagogue is or whatever it is, I want you to have it in front of you, and I want to help you with an on-ramp to understand it. And one of the real challenges for me is, but it's also really delightful, is that while I always teach off the Greek text, I never started my alarm or my timer, Jonathan.
It's been about 10.
Okay, cool. Okay. I always teach off the Greek text, but I really maintain that it's fully possible for everyone in the room with a translation to participate in the dialogue about the text if I can set up on-ramps so that what you bring is that, oh, you've got a different translation. So that's not like, oh, thank you, JV. That's part of the dialogue about this text, right? So, but I want everyone to have a purchase and to have a way to get into this conversation so that it's not just my dialogue with myself and with the evidence. I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. Other goals for myself, one is to actually use my notes. I rarely do. I am at the moment. But usually I write my notes for a lecture and then I pay very little attention to them. The act of drafting the outline is the way that I think into the lecture, and I actually don't so much rely on it. Some of you are nodding, and others of you are wondering about that, but that does seem to work for me. I always, when I leave the class and I think about not just kind of my exalted grade to myself, I always know how many other people have spoken in the class. So don't any of you take my intro New Testament now, please, because you know my secret. But I always make note, and I'm very much aware of how many other people have spoken. I don't think of a lecture as just me and not the class. Now, sometimes you've got to get through a lot of material, and sometimes you can't fully get 25 people into a conversation. But I think some of my most, at least to my mind, successful lectures have been when upwards of 25 people in a room of 60 people have spoken at one time or another in an interactive lecture. I really like that. But then you do that once, and then the rest of the time they're like, "Don't we get to talk today?" Right? So there are sort of ups and down sizes to that. And then lastly, someday I'd actually like to finish a lecture. I don't think I've ever achieved that, but someday that may happen. Now, to what degree do I actually employ the lecture in my teaching? I have addressed that, but Jonathan added an interesting phrase or a follow-up. What do you see as the upside and downside of lecturing a lot or a little in the classroom? I think I've already named the issue, and that's authority. That I've said that one of the worries is that I've got the text and I'm the professor, and in some cases I'm the one who knows the language. So I'm sovereign, right? Whatever I say is what it must mean. And my hermeneutical model doesn't square with that. And my goal in teaching is not merely to sprinkle the seeds of my wisdom and interpretations of these texts. So if I lecture too much, I can subvert that, right, that piece of my pedagogical design, which is trying to say that the hermeneutical work, I think as Professor Nyman said, that it's about the us. It's not just about the impresario professor, professorium. So how do you sort of do that? And if you lecture too much, no matter how much you talk about dialogue, the dialogue doesn't happen, and that can even be worse than inviting dialogue. So I recognize the problem. I also recognize the responsibility, though, that the professor has to create in the classroom a civic space for dialogue, to model in the classroom the ground rules and the virtues for civic dialogue over contested texts. And that's not just going to happen from the ground up. You have to do that in some quite explicit ways. So that's a couple things there. That's not as interesting a question. Or, well, yeah, it is. How do I integrate lecturing with other assignments? I think that, one of the things I do, which is sort of basic, is that I do recognize that for students, being a learner is sometimes fraught with anxieties, especially anxieties about what is expected of me. Never underestimate that, no matter what context you're teaching in. That people want to live up to those expectations. And so being very explicit about this is what's expected of you is, I think, an important ingredient of good pedagogy. I also think it's humane in terms of that on-ramp of allowing people the chance to succeed. So, for example, I have historical events and map quizzes at the beginning of the intro to the study of the New Testament, and I do lectures on both in advance. And I'm very clear that, this is what we're doing, and we're doing this in order to give you a rough and ready introduction to the basic lay of the land of the history of Syria, Palestine in roughly the so-called New Testament period, and roughly the history of the Mediterranean basin. And in those lectures, I try to be as absolutely over as I can, and then build that into the quizzes. So I want everybody to ace those quizzes. Those should be absolutely sort of piece of cake. Here it is, just, But at the same time, history isn't so clean, right? So how do I square back to my brevity and clarity and accuracy? So what I will often do is I will sort of lecture the clean early and then problematize it in the second half of the class. But first, make sure they've got some of the sort of framework, and then complicate it. And I think pedagogically that can work a little bit better. All right, I need to find a really good paratio here. What's it going to look like? Well, a couple of things about technology. You asked whether I used an inverted classroom, and I did by accident once. But, we had a snow day, so I sat in my study with my New Testament, and I lectured to myself on the Gospel of Mark. And I caught it on GarageBand on my MacBook, and I posted it on the talk site. Does that count?
Sure.
Do you remember?
Yeah.
So it now exists somewhere on,
Interwebs.
I don't know, in cyberspace. I think that, so there's that. Secondly, I think I would say that, and maybe this comes a little bit to Professor Nyman's point about the crisis of the lecture. And I think you illustrated this in your example, and certainly it's key for me, is that media have to be not just vehicles of learning, but they have to be objects of study in the work that we do. And so the goal isn't just sort of use technology to teach this non-technologized thing. But if you teach religion, you're teaching about media communicative systems in some way. And so it is thoroughly possible, and I would say essential, not just to teach with media, but to teach in relation to what are these media and how are they working. And this is, of course, great for me as a scholar of early Christianity, because one of the Christians' first real contribution to material culture was a widespread adoption of the codex form. They didn't create it; it was in existence. Marshall's epigrams and other texts used it. But to bring students in right away on that there is a materiality to the textual traditions and bring them into that dialogue is, I think, is I think absolutely crucial. We can talk more about that before. So one of the questions is what counts as technology, right? All right, the last, this is just a segue, I guess, into our Q&A. When I taught high school, I learned lots of lessons from my students there. One of the things I've always been grateful to my luck in teaching graduate students and undergraduates is that when I taught high school, they used to cheat by carving the Ten Commandments into the desks so that they would pass the quiz. I haven't had to deal with that in teaching graduate students. They also, and I love these kids too, but they also taught me, I showed up on time once, probably the only time in my teaching career, and I overheard one of the kids say, "Don't read the Bible. She never quizzes out of the Bible. She only quizzes out of the textbook." And I realized, fail, epic fail. I mean, the whole point of my teaching was to get them to read the text and to think sensibly and independently, and my pedagogy had subverted what I thought I was doing. I learned a lot from that. And then the last is, for me, and I don't know that all of you would have this opportunity, but I would invite you to think about this in your disciplines and fields. There's something about the stoicheia, the basic elemental building blocks of learning. For me, it was teaching elementary Hebrew and elementary Greek. For you, it might be, I don't know, introduction to the Hebrew Bible, whatever it is, but whatever your elemental is, think about what is this transaction of teaching and learning, and how do your students learn. Some of the most formative experiences for me were teaching. You mentioned this as well, teaching a student who was blind. I taught a man who was Korean by birth, for whom English was a second language. I taught him Hebrew and Braille. I learned a lot more from him than he learned from me. I taught other students who maintained they could not learn Hebrew because they were dyslexic or other kinds of things. And literally, in working with them, I learned the challenge. The really hard thing about teaching, well, one of the hard things about teaching is it's relatively easy to teach students who learn the way you do. You do that kind of reflexively, right? And you do that generously, and you do that excitedly. It's harder to teach students who don't learn the way that you learn. And it's not about smarts. It's not necessarily about preparation. It's just people learn differently, and they're at different stages in their skill acquisition. And so thinking about each student, what their skills are, and what they bring to the inquiry, and then how can you, given who you are, best teach those students, that's a really crucial issue. So one last piece of one of those nagging sentences from Boston College that still hangs on my brow. Mary Boyce, who teaches at Union Seminary in New York, said, "For my students, I am both one of the greatest assets to their learning and one of the greatest obstacles to their learning." How do I think about that as a lecturer, as a pedagogue? Taking a cold, reasonable, careful look about how you're both their asset, and also how you might be an obstacle, and how you might address that. So, Jonathan, thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
I thus end the lecturette on lecturing.
Professor Nyman and Dean Mitchell have been kind enough to tackle my questions, but I imagine you have questions more articulate and more constructive than mine, so please.
Can I just say one thing? Sure. So I didn't know this about Dean Mitchell, but I taught in high school for 2 years before I did my master's and PhD, and Hegel had to go and teach in the gymnasium for a few years. And part of what I want to say is that was an amazing experience, and the way you talk. I often don't talk about it, but it's very formative. It was very formative for me because we taught, and Professor Chabelle also did this for a little while, if I remember correctly. Right? There's a window. And I think that's where we are taught, because we're on our feet 24/7 and running, and we don't have time to breathe and to reflect. But sorry.
And I don't know about you, but I taught 5 sections, 3 of one class and 2 of the other. So it really helped me to see how it's never the same. I mean, you're teaching the same material. Sorry, but the hour of the day, the classroom you're in, the personalities, you may think, you may prepare the same. It's always different.
Sir, Professor Nyman, you mentioned that you had your TAs kind of watch what the students were doing in class. What were kind of the results of what they were seeing? Where did the students tune out versus where they were most engaged?
They knew what I was doing, and they also knew how challenged I was technologically. I also want to say that I'm really happy that Rembrandt Night Watch clip, it was a mistake. in it that I couldn't manage it from the remote because it just the setup is different here. Mistakes happen with technology, and you should keep trying. But you should try as much as you can to keep trying out of the classroom and make it work in the classroom. But I do want to say that you only want to try a few things that are new at a single time. They were looking for engagement. They were instructed by me not to interfere and not to kind of put their hand on their shoulder and say, "I'm on Facebook, sweetheart." And I wasn't watching them, but my students watched them, and the PowerPoint engagement, when it was more engaging and kind of more alive, it worked. What I did worked. It was an awful lot of work. But that doesn't mean that they weren't engaged when we were reading texts. They were, but they often needed, I guess, a little more to bring them to life. And this was not because it was the University of Toronto and it wasn't Yale. This is true at Yale, I know how to see the arm muscles when you're texting under a table. So I know that. Because I'm a texter and I'm, constantly multitasking. I don't embarrass students, but occasionally I will tell a student afterwards, I'm sure it was an emergency, but I really don't want you texting in class, because we all did it. And, so your question is a general question about did this kind of attempt at, multimedia stuff work? And I would say yes. It's exhausting. For me, it's exhausting, but I think it's worth it if we achieve the ends that Dean Mitchell was talking about. I mean, we don't always get there, but using it very, I want to say sometimes minimally, sometimes maximally, and we should take baby steps, especially people that are less versed in it. I don't know if that,
In terms of just the use of technology?
Well, no, my question was, were there patterns that emerged from what your graduate students witnessed? So the patterns were they were less engaged when it wasn't multimedia? Or, okay.
Yeah.
That was more the sense of my question.
I'm not sure that I'm willing to give up. There's certain things you have to teach, and the only way to do it is just to teach. I still love that, but I'm not. This is what I meant by this, the crisis moment. But you are going to have to. I think you're going to have to teach differently. In fact, when people are hired now, I've been on lots of hiring committees. This is often part of what you're being evaluated for. I don't know if certainly at Yale the teaching programs develop students technologically.
Michael, yes. Dean Mitchell, this is the first time I've ever heard you say that's not an interesting question. I'm wondering if you could both of us talk about how you see your role as people being questioned and when it is important for you to, so first that part, and then the second part, when you do actually in some way or another communicate, that's not the right question for the material that we're engaging.
Yeah, another, subversion of my fundamental commitments. This was the question about how I integrate technology into the classroom, and there's actually just too long an answer to it because, as some of you know, drawing on artistic images and thinking about image and text is a research question of mine, and it's at the heart of my pedagogy. Michael, you've experienced it, you know that. So that was either a white lie or a misstatement or something. I really do, I think, stand by the proposition that there are no uninteresting questions and there are no stupid questions. I say it a lot in the class, and I really do. I really do believe that is the point. That is really true. At the same time, what I try to do is make that part of the course design. So let me just say, at the beginning of the Intro to the New Testament class, I talk about, first in general terms, myself, talking about the way I structured the course to focus in particular on historical and literary questions. I define what a historical and literary question is, or what they are. But I also then sort of name from previous years of students in the class people who were students of art history who brought certain questions to the class, or people who were interested in constructive theology who brought certain questions, or whatever. And then what I do is, over the years, I've developed then a written handout that lists and, most importantly, categorizes 7 or 8 different kinds of questions that people have asked about the New Testament materials, with examples, so that not only are people being told sort of, here's a mapping of a terrain of these questions, but that each of them corresponds with certain kinds of warrants for argument and evidence, certain kinds of structures of argument, certain conversation partners who you would expect to be a part of those questions, and certain methods for following up those questions. And so the idea there isn't to say you can't ask those questions here so much as to say, here's this broad terrain, you're entering the history of interpretation in this way. There's one, though, caveat to what I just said about you can't ask those questions here, which is that I do say that Room 106 is not an ecclesia. That when I teach the introduction to the New Testament, that the community of inquiry that's in this classroom is not itself a worshiping community. And therefore questions that seem to presume something about this group or the context of the academic study of religion, which are not, in fact, the way this dialogue is constructed, then in those instances I have to decide in the moment how to say, this is a question that properly might be posed in these ways, in these contexts. And it's utterly fine that that's a question that's your question, but you are a member of a class with 60 people in it, and not everyone is constituted around that question in the same way. Do you want to respond to that?
No, I think that's
If I can actually just say something else about questions, and this is just as much as learning how to answer our questions well as teachers, how to teach students how to ask great questions. Yeah. So we both privilege and celebrate participation as part of our grade. I have no doubt, I've not looked at your syllabi, but I have no doubt that it's way up there. The problem is vapid questions or unprepared questions, by which I mean the students that it's not mean-spirited, but they're trying to participate or they're trying to demonstrate engagement without preparation. And this can be, one can teach a student that, and this is about being a responsible citizen within a community. And this is also something that I think it's upon us to teach our students. So, don't ask me a sidebar question, but I will often put it back to them. So how does that relate to the text we just read? Are you talking about verse 3? Is that where it's coming from? Yeah. And this is a way of signaling to the student, ask in an informed way, and engage, and use airtime really responsibly.
I think that's really important. I think it's hard, though. I mean, that students take a risk in asking a question, and I think almost all in overwhelmingly 90 or more % of the time, there's something in a question that you can work. There's something that you can make it a broader question. The harder part, and this is one of the programs in the craft of teaching this quarter is on this. The hardest part is when someone says something that either knowingly or unknowingly is offensive to other people in the room. And in teaching the New Testament, texts that have a history of reception and involvement in anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, and misogyny, and abuse of women, and other things. That how does one save that moment? How does one honor the questioner as intending to be civil? Now, maybe that's a fault to grant that, but I want to grant that. But at the same time not grant that to the degree that it may appear implicitly to condone a viewpoint that seems beyond the pale, ethically or, particularly ethically is what I'm thinking about here. in terms of that's a difficult challenge, and I think that becomes one of the cases where if you've already created in the classroom a place where each interpreter has a voice, then you don't necessarily have to be the only one who's the monitor of that. But sometimes you do have to say, in fact, that very viewpoint has led to such and such and such and such, or whatever. And but this is always a challenge because the questioner may have been naive, or the questioner may actually be pushing your button, or intending to push others, and then you have to figure out, how do I maintain a civil environment here? Now, you didn't mention it, Mindy, but I think you might have alluded to it, that there's life outside of class. I mean, you can pull someone, you can invite someone to your office, you can say, I really appreciate your contributions to the class, but you might consider perhaps just, pulling back on the airtime, or, there are things that can be done other than in that moment solve all issues.
And there are different places to do it. Sometimes it's really effective to do it in a cafe. Like sometimes, if the right space is a rather public space where you have an informal conversation, which is quite complicated, at other times it's better to have a rather formal conversation in an office. But to be creative and thoughtful about also how to act quickly when something goes wrong in the classroom. And here, it can be as small as someone being dismissive or rude to somebody else. And as the community can fall to pieces very, very quickly that you've worked so hard to build. As long as, it's generally, the professor knows he or she is in charge, you can be pretty chill. But it's often about, student-to-student violence or offense.
Yeah. And can I say that we all get surprised. We're not like the omni-moral arguer. There are things that maybe didn't bother you, but bother someone else. One of the first things when I was teaching at the seminary was we had 2 students leave seminary one day over the fact that Robert Bowling, my colleague of blessed memory, who wrote Judges in the Anchor Bible, I don't know if you know it, but he has this whole lecture about humor in the book of Jonah. And 2 students said, the Bible is not funny. We're out of here. We're out of here. And caught us both completely by surprise. Now, that's obviously an extreme example, but it is important to say that there are times when you aren't aware. And so that's another part of it, is it's not just you bringing them to your office. They need to feel comfortable to come to you and to say, did you not see what happened there? These are tough things.
This is not a fully formed question, but for those of you that know me, my blue tape is everywhere in this school. I'm sure Merrick kind of hates me, but to what extent does something like Facebook, checking your scores on ESPN, I don't know, what else do people do in a classroom? Read, or look at Vogue or something, look at pictures. I don't know, I'm not sure what different students are doing when they're sitting in a lecture setting while the lecturer is up there teaching, but to what extent can that actually facilitate their learning? Is it that much different than, say, doodling in the margins?
My answer is no. My answer is it's not different. And this is part of what I said at the end about learning how to trust your students. There are lots of different, and time doesn't permit to talk about the different models that my colleagues at Yale have used to try to create contracts, silent contracts, and implicit agreements. I think that we have to trust our students as learners, and that multitasking for them is often the best way to learn. We also have to take into account community that we're constructing as well. That is, if I'm texting someone and I'm really focusing on everything you're saying, and I really am, to what extent is this a distraction to 2 or 3 people around you? And we have to think about that. Hamlet's Blackberry, I thought about this earlier because you talked about the codex. It's a very playful book. written by a journalist who talks about all the new technologies. It was a bestseller a bunch of years ago. I picked it up. I stuck in an airport for 4 hours. But it was so inspiring to me because it was about how the BlackBerry is a new technology. It was also about blue time, which is another way of talking about Shabbat, or the Sabbath, or taking time off. But we, as teachers, should be humbled by these extraordinary things that our children and our students and our colleagues can now do at the same time. I think it's astounding. And I want to embrace it, and I want to learn from it, and I want to continue to teach. But to tell you to stop if you actually need to do that while you're learning is not very productive. When your students are doodling or they're writing, sometimes they're actually getting information from me. I had this incredible experience when I was teaching the scrolls. The first time I taught an intro to the scrolls in Toronto, I had students who were looking stuff up for me all the time, and they actually became my go-to people. Like I would say, did you find an image of the Geniza material? Because I was doing this comparative move. And that became really fun and productive. And I said to them, work with me, support me, find the links. Or I taught adaptation, we were talking about the film, and they said, oh, well, there are 3 other films that this director did, and you've seen this professor and I did. And it was actually very relevant because they did this and they did that. And it was a moment, and it was circumscribed but productive. So this is a long way of saying, I meant to say, let's be very responsible about encouraging students to stay focused and work together so we can actually read. Or we can, there are different skill sets that we were talking about in the context of both of our presentations. And I had a radical example, which I didn't put in my presentation because I thought Dean Mitchell is going to think I've really lost it. But I'll share it with you. I want to figure out how to let students text to me while I'm lecturing. How to keep it live. But that was just a joke. No, I know it happens here. Jim Conant, I was just talking to him in philosophy, was telling me this does happen. We were talking a little bit about the presentation, and I asked him, how do I think, Dean Mitchell was going to receive this presentation? And he said, well, I have colleagues that are doing this here, but this is the Black Eyed Peas do it in a concert, and they rap the language. I mean, this is fun, and it's crazy, and it's interesting, but what kind of lecture is that useful for, and what kind of lecture is it a distraction for? And that's part of when we're teaching, a very important, text, and we're trying to teach content or layers or what do we do? When is it productive? When is it not productive? When I was teaching the Foucault text, it would have been really fun to problematize, not just what they did and didn't understand, but we were problematizing this performance of this little piece called What is an Author? And essentially that's what they did. They prepared texts for me, although they weren't in my margins. Other presentations wouldn't have been productive. So I think it's all. I think we have to be. I think we're trying to offer suggestions to all of you and to ourselves, but we also have to understand ourselves as people and as teachers, and what we can also tolerate or engage in productively.
I would say a couple of things, sort of honestly, about this. That. I really worry about what kind of human beings we're becoming, and I put myself at the top of the list. The ability to engage in sustained thought is why I love being an academic. It takes me a long time to get inside a text, and when I'm in there, I know I'm in there, but it's like deep sea diving, and then when I'm in there, I can do all kinds of things. I think I'm in its logic. I think I'm in its structure. I think I can, that's where I think I'm analyzing the sources best, and posing, and able to deal with questions in relation to them. And, I'm nostalgic for my graduate student days where I spent 10, 12 hours in Regenstein just working on my stuff, just thinking with it. Now, partly you're hearing an academic administrator speaking, but partly that's the technology of our time is I know how distractible I am. At the same time, my LSJ is in here, right? I mean, I can access LSJ faster than I ever, no Mexican thumb anymore. Well, maybe it's just the tip of the thumb. That's all. So, but I try to think about that. And so, like, one of my favorite moments of teaching last year was when I was teaching the Gospel of Mark class, and we got into one of those riffs, and we were up there in room 200, and off we went, and the next thing we knew, it was 10 o'clock. And one of the students, as we were leaving, said, "That's the longest I've gone without either texting or going to the bathroom in the last, 5 years of my life." And it wasn't any of you who were here, but some of you were in that class, right? I mean, and so I love that. I love that. And if not here, where? If we can't do that in academia, where? On the other hand, we'd be nuts not to say, get a picture of the Cairo Geniza, manuscript up here. I mean, I'm with you on the immediacy, and there are moments when the immediacy solves that problem, and then we're better because we can move on beyond it. But at the same time, I think really holding out for the fact that we are countercultural. We are, I mean, as academics, we are, and I don't mean that the culture is all bad, but I do mean that, you guys, you want to make your life in the world of ideas and people. That's what you're choosing, and so don't lose that with the realm of distraction. So you got to figure out when and where and how.
But to be fair, we're talking about a lot of different things. Reading groups that I do, whether it's for an hour or for 3 hours, no one's online, and they would never be online. They wouldn't be there.
They wouldn't be checking, parsing.
They come with texts. They come with their primary text and some notes. Occasionally there's a computer, but that's not what they're doing. And it's just not. That's the energy of a reading group. I think we're trying to think about engaging students. I was thinking primarily about freshmen and sophomores in lectures. And what does it mean? I've been thinking a lot about the crisis in the humanities, and this is why I called it a crisis in lecturing. That's what everyone's talking about in Yale. All of the humanities enrollments are all the way down. So how do you bring them back to life and make humanities majors again, so that it matters? Even if they're going corporate, it's okay. But for those 4 years, be a philosophy major, or be a art history major, and what does that mean? But I agree that there's no place when you're reading for that kind of interruption. I mean, when I'm lost in a text, you were asking me about when I started reading Syriac and I was talking about, we spent 4 or 5 hours at a time with Joe Amar when I was first reading Syriac texts, and the two of us just sat together for hours at a time, and you get lost in a text, and that's what in some sense it is to read. But that's not what I spoke to. I spoke to kind of risk-taking, and you're going to be asked to be exciting lecturers and to do, to keep your students in your seats. And most of you, I would think, are going to have jobs, and if you fail to have sustained enrollments, it may compromise your tenure. And I'm being very realistic. This is not our problem right now. We're having fun. We're taking risks. And I actually just wanted to have fun and make a difference in the humanities at Yale as tenured faculty. So, but for you, it's something you're going to have to worry about. So what are you going to do? And to get up there and to say, this is just what I do, and I'm not going to engage you in any other way. And I hope it may not be good enough. And I wanted to help in that way, even though I know that part of what I shared was a bit outrageous.
Sorry, please.
Professor Nunn, if I could just follow up on something that you said, and pardon me if I'm perfect. I was really surprised to hear you say you don't think there's a difference between checking Facebook and Googling, because, and maybe this is just my inability to understand how other people's brains work, but if I'm looking at Facebook or I'm texting, I am not listening to you. I can't. My brain,
so I have watched.
I mean, I can Google and listen to you, but I can't. So is this just me not getting?
So it actually, and this is part of what I'm trying to say, that part of what I'm saying may be personal difference. I've observed students doing it. I've had assistants who worked for me when I had an administrative position, and I was really upset that while she was taking notes, she was on Facebook. I kind of lost it. I mean, not on her, but I kind of like, what does this even mean? And the students that I knew that I was close with, or people, nieces, nephews that were around the same age, they said, you just don't understand, Mindy. Like, this is what we do. This is the way we think. I have 2 children. In fact, they're more attentive if it's a Facebook distraction than they are with a doodling distraction. There are going to be studies that are done. And part of what I'm trying to do is embrace multitasking. I'm not saying it's true for you or it's true for me. I'm trying to meet the students, where they are, and then help them join me in participating in a 6-hour session in the library. I want to help them understand my ethic for submission to a text. I wasn't being provocative or extreme. I actually think that they're constantly looking in that corner, but they're actually focusing. And to go back to that earlier question, there's studies, I've started reading some of them because I'm really interested about multitasking and concentration and focus. I'm not qualified to fully answer your question. But I think students, our minds are changing, and I think ultimately we're going to be able to sustain deep reading. But the next 10 to 15 years is going to be a time of real transition. Neither of us really answered this question about online teaching, which is very interesting. I think I'm not replaceable, and I don't think it's because I'm arrogant or full of self-importance. I think that I've been reluctant to do online classes. I've been invited to do it. I don't like it, and I don't like seeing myself on them. I like human interaction and not freezing a lecture because, as Dean Mitchell said, it's never the same again. And I'm lecturing. My response to you and the energy in this room has a lot to do with the people that I know that I interacted with last night, and what I said and what I didn't say, and the conversations that I had. And I love that. And it was far more personal for Dean Mitchell because of who's in this room and who has experienced her teaching and her thinking and her writing. It's a long answer, but it's. I don't know, and you have to figure it out in your own context. But there are people in this room who said last night, I tell them to close their computers and there is no Facebook, Wi-Fi is off. I'm not sure you've solved your problem. You can still multitask. How many files are opened up when you're in a lecture course and you've got a paper due? Let me ask the question that way. I mean, what do you do when you've got, I don't mean, you don't need to answer me, but to what extent are we managing different things, and are we supposed to cut them a little bit of slack and help them help themselves and help us be participants in the classroom?
We have time for perhaps one more question.
In your lecturing for introductory class, say, Holy Theology or Intro to New Testament, how do you keep the balance between delivering some general and fundamental information and the intricacy and complexity of current scholarly debate on a given topic?
Well, I just as a simple start to that question, as you may know, consistent with what I think are crucial tools. I first try to teach students how to read an ancient Greek letter. It's a papyrus letter from Egypt. It's not a Christian text, and it's not all that an unremarkable text. It's a basic early Christian, a basic Greek letter of the 1st, 2nd century. And then I invite them, with those skills in mind, to turn to a text and analyze it without any secondary literature whatsoever. And I do it that way because I think they now have some new skills, and I tell them that this is a basic issue for you guys. So I go to how do you sign your emails? Ciao, or later, or some little tag from Euripides because you're really cool, or what do you have on And so I say any epistolary author in the ancient world customizes forms. So you don't need to know Greek to do that. You can go and you can, so they can, I think, get a sense of the framing. The harder part is I don't give them tools about rhetoric. I just say, see if you can follow what the Greeks call it the alcalothea. See if you can follow the logic in this argument. But I give them some tools for historical reconstruction and other things. That assignment has worked well for me, I think, or for them, I hope, over the years, in terms of not just me saying, now I will tell you definitively what Pauline scholars, or what I say, about the letter to the Galatians. When students have done that assignment, they come in and they have skin in the game. They've made up their own mind. It's on paper. They have 9 pages of commitment of their own reading of Galatians. And then the dialogue is one that they're not spectators to. On the other hand, there are times when you just need to say, look at this phrase, Christus Jesu Christou. What could it mean? You don't have to know Greek to know, wow, it could be Jesus' own faith, or it could be faith in Jesus. Now let's talk. Right? And that's what I mean in my first part when I said I have to model, I think, for them ways of adjudicating arguments. I can't only say, here are 2 viewpoints, they're intractable, pick one, flavor of the day. I mean, I think the work that we do is about assessing better arguments from worse. So I want to represent both sides in their best, strongest form, and then I want to say, this is why, this is my judgment, and what do you think? So, I mean, I think that's pretty basic teaching critical thinking skills, and that's kind of what I mean by on-ramps, having people join a dialogue themselves and, having to come to a judgment. There are times, however, when I may not know what I think. Most of you know in this room, I still haven't made up my mind about Colossians. I'm going to be 95 and wondering, do I think Paul wrote Colossians? And in that point, I will say, this is why I can't make up my mind. These are the arguments I see on both sides.
So that's an incredibly valuable thing for students to see them to see them think through different positions, but also to let them know that you had a position, in 1983, but it's different it's different in 2014. It's an incredibly exciting moment when they see you change your own position, and it also, I think, makes them feel a little more safe. Can I go back to Sarah's question for just one second? I mean, it's going back to what they're doing or not doing. In developing this, the most radical, starting with your question, but ending up with AOF this past fall semester, I consulted Kate Lofton. Some of you know her. She's my DUS in the department, the undergraduate studies director. I built the class with 4 doctoral students, whom I like very much and I think with. And they brought a lot of my examples to me. I said, this is what I'm looking for. They're in their 20s. I'm in my 40s. That helped me a lot. I wouldn't have pulled out Daft Punk. It just wouldn't have happened. And I don't even like it very much. I like 12-tone music. I mean, but it wasn't. I'm serious about this. Like, this is not who I am as someone who loves music. But I also told them that I was reaching out to them and in conversation with doctoral students to think with them and to help me think better about how to teach antiquity. And then they gave me lists after the course about how to make it better next time. And they want to come into the class next year in the fall, and they want to work with me. And I said, you can't come at the beginning because it's going to be too overwhelming, and and then we'll have an enrollment problem and all of that. But they're going to come in and they want to perform for them, and they want to think with them about the examples from the class. So it worked. I mean, the trust worked, and the openness worked. And if it failed, I was prepared to never teach the class again. And that's okay. So I failed. I was prepared to fail.
They were wonderful clips, though. And I think the juxtapositions were absolutely fascinating. And it was neat to imagine being in the room for those conversations.
And I gave you about 25% of the material. And a lot of material I couldn't get to. I mean, I had the same problem about the lecture, about never finishing the material. I posted it for them. I posted a lot of these clips online, and then they were able to just respond to me and talk to me about it.
Well, we are out of time, and I wish we could stay till 10 o'clock to keep the tradition going. Last week, Canterbury Fusion, thank you for your questions. Thank you both for engaging our questions, and please join me in thanking you.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.